Kia ora, and welcome to those of you who have joined us on this presentation for occupational regulation. We're going to get underway in 10 minutes time, so just get yourself relaxed and ready to go. We'll just do occasional sound checks just to make sure that you're able to hear us. So we'll be getting underway at 12 noon. Kia ora, and welcome to those of you who have joined us online. We'll be getting underway with this presentation around at 12 noon. So please just take a few moments to get yourself settled and ready for us to get underway. We will be making occasional announcements just so that you can check your audio, that everything is working for those of you who are now in the room. Kia ora, and welcome to those of you who have just recently joined us in the room. We will be getting underway in a little over 5 minutes time, so just make sure you're nice and relaxed and ready to go for a 12 noon start. We just do occasional sound checks as we go along, just to make sure that you can hear us and things like that. So welcome aboard, and we'll be getting underway shortly. Kia ora and welcome again to those of you who have just recently joined us for the occupational regulation presentation. We'll be getting underway in a few moments' time. Just in the lead up to the presentation, we will be making occasional announcements just so everybody can be sure that their audio is working as it should be. We are recording this session, so please rest assured that the session is being recorded. Great to see more of you joining us in the room, ready to get underway for the occupational regulation presentation. We've just got a couple of moments until we get underway. Just like to say that, again, we are recording this presentation, so anything that is said between our panelists will be recorded. We are really going to encourage you to ask us questions as we go along, so please do use the Q&A panel to be able to ask your questions. The presenters will do their utmost to be able to answer questions in the Q&A time. However, if we're unable to do so, we will address these post-session. So please rest assured, if your question is not answered, it's not being ignored. It just may be that we won't be able to get to it on time. So yeah, just take a few more moments before we get underway. Again, it's great to see a lot of you all still joining the room now. We will be getting underway very shortly. So just to reiterate to those of you who have just come into the room, we are recording today's session, and we do ask you to use the Q&A chat panel to ask your questions. So our presenters will make every attempt to answer these questions. Sorry about that, welcome off the alarm clock. So now what I shall do is hand over to Stacey to get us underway.
Thanks, Leanne. Good afternoon. It is just afternoon now, so I can say that. Welcome everyone, and to those just joining online now, we're just kicking off, so you haven't missed anything yet. I'm going to be facilitating today's webinar, so I will begin with a karakia before doing a round of introductions, a bit of an overview of why we're all here today, before I pass to the MB team. Whakataka te ho ki te uru, whakataka te ho ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hiaka ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hohu, ti he moriora. I'm Stacey Campbell. I'm a General Manager here at Engineering New Zealand. With us today is our Chief Executive, Richard Templer, as well as our guests from MB. Amy Moorhead, who is the Manager of Building Policy, Caroline Ryder, Acting Principal Policy Advisor, and Savannah Taryn Sweeney, who's a Senior Policy Advisor. So today we're going to hear from the MB team about Cabinet's recent decisions to change the way that engineers are regulated. Cabinet's decisions in March mark the start of a journey that's going to take us through the drafting of new legislation to the introduction of a two-tier regulatory system. So in the future, all practicing engineers will need to be registered, and some engineers will need to be licensed. That means CPinch, our current system, will be phased out. So this is a big change for the engineering profession and one that Engineering New Zealand supports. So the way our webinar is going to run today, we'll have a presentation from the MB team. We'll have a summary of Engineering New Zealand's response to the announcements. And then we should have a decent amount of time for some questions and answers. So for those of you who missed Leanne's introduction as you were coming in, there's a Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you can write your questions. We'll do as best we can to answer as many as we can, but if we don't have time, we will record them and give you answers at a later time. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it if you have to duck out midway through. If you can, try and keep your questions short and concise so that we can answer them more quickly and easily. So without further ado, I'm going to pass to Caroline from MB to get us started.
Thanks very much, Stacey, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about the changes that are going to affect the engineering profession in the coming years. So just before I get into the detail, I just want to talk a bit about why occupational regulation. So we regulate occupations primarily for public safety reasons. So we want to protect the public from harm from negligent, reckless or incompetent practitioners. So it's public safety. It's also avoiding environmental damage and economic costs. So we interpret harm quite widely. So occupational regulation puts in standards that the profession are expected to maintain. There's usually barriers to entry, and there are sanctions for poor behaviour or performance. There are always costs to regulated persons, so the government uses a framework when considering whether to regulate an occupation or not, primarily looking at the risks. So if we look at engineering, there's a really low probability of engineering failures causing harm. We don't know how big it happens. It's very infrequent, but as we've seen recently, there are potentially catastrophic consequences. So we all know about the CTV building. There are other examples elsewhere. The drinking water contamination up in Havelock North. We've seen some failures in the heavy vehicle industry as well. And the thing about engineering is it is a really specialised profession. So lay people like myself, we can't identify the risks because we lack the knowledge and expertise to do so. Or engineering defects can be hidden in buildings or in machinery. So the risks are generally assumed involuntarily by the public. So when we're looking at the current way that we regulate engineers, we do have a system where our engineers are highly professional, but our system's flawed. So we've got quite a significant number of engineers who are operating outside of a regulatory regime. So these are the engineers who aren't members of a professional body or are not CPinch. It's hard to hold engineers to account when standards slip, and we've got no way of removing particularly incompetent, reckless engineers from practicing. So if you're a bad engineer, we can't do anything about it. And in those high-risk practice fields, it's difficult to ensure that those engineers are competent, are skilled. So last year, we went out for consultation on 3 proposals. First proposal is a universal registration scheme for all engineers. This is intended to ensure a base level of professionalism. The second proposal is a new licensing regime for those practicing in high-risk fields. And the third proposal was to set up a new regulator. And we were very pleased with the response we got. We got 250 submissions. Our document was downloaded about 3,000 times. And as you can see from the pie chart on the left, the vast majority, 85% of submitters were engineers. We did ask the question about what engineering discipline people identified with, and we got, it was over 20 disciplines that we got, but quite an even split between the major ones. In terms of what submitters thought of the proposals, we asked about 30 questions in the discussion document, and these are the key questions. So we asked whether submitters agreed if there was a case for intervention. 84% agreed. We asked about whether registration should apply to all. We asked about our proposal for a 2-tier model, so having a board and then a regulatory service provider providing the day-to-day servicing. We also asked about whether we should include allied professionals. So these are the engineering technicians and technologists. And we also asked whether the engineering profession would like a new title. Now, as you can see, I mean, we always get people disagree, and that's to be expected, but we did get a very positive response to these questions. Just on the registration question, the people that disagreed gave a variety of reasons why registration shouldn't apply to the whole profession. A lot of it came down to the risk level. So some people said that their engineering discipline was at lower risk than others. Others said that the product that they are working on is regulated, that's sufficient. There were a lot of people who said that the current regime is adequate. And a few people said that the company they work within have their own processes to maintain quality. So we've summarised these submissions. We pulled together a proposal and went to Cabinet. And as Stacey said, last month, Cabinet agreed to develop a bill to establish a new occupational regulatory regime for engineers. This is the first bit, registration. So all persons who provide professional engineering services will need to be registered. We did have a bit of discussion in the discussion document about what professional engineering services actually means. It's been quite a hard thing to tie down. About half of the submitters said it was fine. Another proportion said it was too broad. Another proportion said it was too narrow. We will be refining what professional engineering services is while we're drafting in the bill and during the select committee phase. But one of the concerns that many submitters had was that the definition would pull in other similar occupations, such as electricians or marine engineers, licensed aircraft maintenance engineers. So we'll be providing for regulations that can explicitly include or exclude certain services. We'll also be, the board can also provide some guidance about what professional engineering services is. It's something that the state of Victoria has done. Another thing that came through in submissions, which we hadn't really thought about too much in the discussion document, was overlap with other regimes, and in particular the civil aviation and maritime transport regimes. So aviation engineers are already being regulated by the CAA. It doesn't make sense to have them regulated by two different entities. So there will be provisions to prevent or avoid overlap with other regimes. The eligibility for registration, this is going to be set by a new board through rules. We're expecting that this will be an appropriate qualification and recognition of those who come up through an alternative pathway. This is something that submitters disagreed with us on. So 80% of submitters said, well, actually it should include experience and or competence. But what we want is that we want all engineers, regardless of where they are in their career, to be thinking about their professional behaviour and to be sanctioned for any transgressions. So registration is a mark of professionalism. There's going to be a code of ethical conduct and professional development requirements. Very strong support from submitters on this. And we're going to be creating a separate register for registered engineering associates. We're likely going to be repealing the Engineering Associates Act. This will be a voluntary regime. And we see this as being a bit of a pathway for licensing for technicians and technologists. Those people who aren't eligible to be registered as an engineer, but still want to practice in a restricted practice field, that will be for licensing. So on to licensing. This isn't a particularly new concept. We consulted on this back in 2019 and had quite strong support. What we're looking at doing here is restricting who can practice in high-risk practice fields. So these are practice fields where there is a greater need for an engineer to demonstrate their competence. They're going to be established by way of regulations. This gives us a lot more flexibility than putting this in the Primary Act. So these classes will be, they can be made bespoke to the practice field. For example, there might be some different eligibility criteria. And we are looking at licensing individuals only. We did ask the question about whether we should allow for companies to be licensed. We discarded this because it shifts the onus of ensuring an engineer's competence from a regulator to a private body. And we want to avoid the situation where an incompetent engineer just shifts from company to company. In terms of what the licensing classes will be, this hasn't been set yet, but what we've indicated is that it's likely to be structural, fire, geotech, and recreational safety. I think those will be the first cabs off the rank. There's some other ones that were, as the regime develops, where there's a need to for an engineer to demonstrate their competence, we'll be looking at adding others. So we did make some changes as a result of consultation. We're going to be providing for auditing of licensed engineers. And we're also including an explicit requirement for the Minister to consult with professional bodies and the public, which is engineers, when developing regulations. This is something that we should do anyway as a matter of good policy, but just putting it as a requirement in the Act really strengthens that. So on to the governance arrangements. I talked earlier about setting up a new board. We're going to be calling it the Engineers Registration Board. This board is going to be appointed by the Minister and accountable to the Minister. There's several different components to this. So down on the bottom, the registrar will be doing the day-to-day functions for the board. So setting up the registry, assessing candidates for registration, that sort of thing. In the bill, it will be MB as a default, but in order to retain flexibility in the regime, the Minister will be able to designate another entity as the registrar or appoint additional registrars. And this will be done through regulations. There's also a complaints officer function, again, MB or another entity, who will receive triage complaints and then refer them on to a disciplinary committee. So the graph looks a bit complicated, but it's really intended to keep as much flexibility in the system as possible. It's going to take us a wee while to set this regime up and to transition everyone across to it. So there will be some transitional arrangements. What these are likely to include is arrangements that cover off what happens to CPinch. So CPinch will expire at the end of the transitional period. In the meantime, Engineering New Zealand will continue to act. And there will also need to be some provisions that allow the new board to hear complaints relating to historic behaviour. We asked the question in consultation about whether we should have some deeming provisions for those engineers who've already demonstrated they would meet the eligibility requirements. If it's a straight qualification, CPinch and Engineering New Zealand's members already do that. So this had strong support for registration from submitters. We also asked whether this should apply to licensing, and that was much more muted. It would really depend on a case-by-case basis whether someone has demonstrated they meet what will be in the new license class about who can qualify or not. We're also going to be including some provisions that give the board enough time to make decisions on registration or licensing and allowing engineers to continue to practice. People being people, there will be a glut of applications at the last possible moment. We don't want the board or the registrar being inundated with tens of thousands of applications in the last week. So we're going to give the board enough time to start to process those. So in terms of the next steps, where we're at now, we've got cabinet decisions and MB's legal team is now drafting instructions for the Parliamentary Council office. So the PCO are the people who draft up the bills. We're anticipating towards the end of this year, there will be a bill introduced that will be referred to Select Committee. And after that, things are much less out of our control because it becomes a parliamentary process. But we're thinking the bill will be enacted, well, we're hoping the bill will be enacted next year, get the board appointed the following year and get all the supporting regulations and rules prepared. We'll have a transitional period where we roll everyone into the new regime. And in 2030, which sounds like a very long way away, the new regime will be in place. We'll have lots of happy registered licensed engineers, and then that will be the time when the CPinch would be repealed. So this is just a slide on the parliamentary process, because I know not everyone is familiar with it. We're at the very top of this at the moment, so we're drafting up the bill, and later this year it's going to be introduced, which is the first step. Your next opportunity will be at the Select Committee process. So the Select Committee will publish the bill and call for submissions on it. Have a look at the bill when it comes out. If there's things that you like, tell the Select Committee. If there's things you don't like, please tell the Select Committee, and if you've got suggestions. And if it's, I really encourage people to go and appear to appear at the Select Committee, because that gives them an opportunity to ask you questions. So that was my last slide. We have published the Cabinet papers and decisions. There's a summary of submissions and a cost benefit analysis on our website. And if you have any questions, yeah, please feel free to contact us or go through Engineering New Zealand. Thank you. So that's me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks so much, Caroline. That was a really helpful summary of what's happened and what's going to happen next. I'm going to move now to Richard, who is our Chief Executive, to talk a bit about Engineering New Zealand's response to the announcements, and then we'll come to question time for questions for both Engineering New Zealand and for MB. So stay on the line, Caroline.
So kia ora, Stacey, and thank you very much for your presentation, Caroline. We thought it would be useful to touch on the principles with which Engineering New Zealand on your behalf has approached occupational regulation, our response to proposal, and then where to from here. So our principles have been, in consultation with the engineering profession, that a regulatory system should be simple to understand and operate. So we don't want too much complexity, that it should work for the whole profession. So all engineers, technicians, technologists and geologists, and that it should pitch government oversight at the right level. We're very comfortable that the proposals from MB clearly addressed the principles 1 and 2. It is simple to understand and operate. It will work for the whole profession. And the government oversight is something we'll obviously continue to work with MB on. So our response has been very much to support this proposal. We know that all engineers have been looking for improvements in occupational regulation, and you can see that by the very strong response the proposal received. It is that, this has been a long process, and so we're particularly delighted that it's now happening. That Cabinet have made this decision, that we'll see the bill introduced and we will see changes in occupational regulation. And so that's a really significant step, and it's one that's strongly supported by Engineering New Zealand and the profession. We also know that occupational regulation is only one part of the process in terms of lifting the standard, lifting the bar for the engineering profession. So we will continue to work on all the other aspects, and we will have our systems report coming out this year, which will detail some of the other things that can be done to lift the bar for the profession. So in terms of what next, key thing to note, it's business as usual. All the things Engineering New Zealand does on behalf of the profession, we will continue to do. We'll also make sure we keep you well informed on all the stages in the government process, and we'll be continuing to have webinars like this, consultation sessions, and of course the opportunity to engage in our online forum to feed your opinions back into us, and hopefully for us to answer any questions you have. We'll also be, to a certain extent, focusing on some work to support the transition. So we'll be thinking about in terms of, what are the projects we need to accelerate, what are the projects we need to change in reflection of this new occupational regulation reality. And we'll obviously be keeping you informed about these things as they progress. So the key thing is, it's business as usual. All the things you currently do with Engineering New Zealand, you'll continue to do, including doing things like applying for CPinch, because obviously the transition will go out to 2030. So we're going to keep rolling with business as usual. We're going to engage in the government process and work with you on that. And we will be looking at some refocus to support the transition. So now I'll stop sharing so we can start our discussion.
Thanks, Richard. The questions are coming in thick and fast. So again, apologies if we don't have time to answer all of them. There are a couple of ones that came in towards the start for Engineering New Zealand, which I can answer fairly briefly, and then we've got a few in a row for the MB team. Now, the answer to some of these questions may simply be we don't know yet, because we, as Caroline explained really well, we're at the start of this process. So although the high-level framework decisions have been made by Cabinet, there's still a lot to work through. So don't be disillusioned if the answer is we'll find out. The first question is, what happens to members who are chartered members of Engineering New Zealand and International Professional Engineer New Zealand? So good question. The simple answer is nothing. At this stage, chartered member is a membership class of Engineering New Zealand, and International Professional Engineer is an international register. So these classes are not affected by occupational regulation, and we know that they're important for international mobility. That said, we will of course need to review our membership structure as a result of occupational regulation and make sure that it's still fit for purpose and serves the future. Next question is, will Engineering New Zealand continue to remain the national competence assessment and regulatory body during the transition phase? And the answer to that is yes. We are the registration authority under the CPinch Act. And so as long as that Act remains in force, it'll be situation normal. As Caroline said, there'll be robust transition procedures in place to manage the change from one system to the other. Some questions for the MB team now. First, will registration only be for those who hold a Washington Accord degree? What if someone's training is from a country or university outside the Accord?
We did get a few submissions on this. It's clearly a concern for many engineers. The regulator will be setting the eligibility requirements, and the easiest thing to do is just to say Washington Accord degree is required. But there are a number of engineers who've come through alternative pathways. My neighbour is a mechanical engineer. He doesn't have an engineering degree, but he came in through an apprenticeship. So there needs to be some allowance for those people who either don't have a professional engineering degree, but who are practicing engineering, or who have a qualification from a country that's not part of the Washington Accord.
Next is a question that I'm sure you've had many times in different forms. How will you define what is engineering? Will this include, for example, electrical, aeronautical, chemical, civil, mechanical, and will it include both design or operational context work?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that we have thought about since the onset of this work. In terms of the breadth, the answer is yes, it's going to cover all major engineering disciplines and their sub-branches. So chemical, mechanical, aeronautical, it will cover those. We do have a definition. It's kind of a working definition of professional engineering services. So it's talking about the sort of activities that engineers do. But what is key is it involves the application of engineering principles and judgment. So that's our working definition, and this is something that we will be working with our lawyers and the lawyers from PCO, our Parliamentary Council Office, in drafting, and it's going to be further refined during the Select Committee process. It's quite a tricky thing to have tied down. Engineering is used so broadly these days. I had a question about whether this would apply to social engineering, which the answer is no.
Not an easy task. The next question, MB, is what if I am an engineer from another country? Will I be able to register in New Zealand?
Yes. Yep. If you're an engineer you're providing services in New Zealand or for in New Zealand, you would need to be registered or be supervised by a New Zealand registered engineer. What we've proposed is to set up a temporary registration class for those engineers who are overseas based, who are providing really specialist services, and where it's not appropriate for someone local to be supervising them. So this is going to be a short time-bound registration. Won't have the professional development obligations on, and someone would be able to apply for it, you know, at the same time as they're thinking about getting a working visa. But anyone would be eligible to apply. It's the same as if you are wanting to provide services in the state of Victoria and New South Wales or Queensland. You know, it's engineering is a global activity these days. So yeah, we're trying to be a bit pragmatic about what we require there.
Wonderful. If someone is already a chartered professional engineer or Engineering New Zealand member, and I think you may have touched on this already in your discussion of the transitional arrangements, what will this mean for me? Will I need to re-register? I guess the implication is, would people be automatically be transferred over to the new system?
Yes, I mean, this is something that we'll be working with the drafters of the bill on, but that's our intention, is that we make this as painless as possible. If you have already demonstrated eligibility in some way that's robust, you know, there's no reason why we can't just seamlessly pull them across to the new regime.
One more for you, Embi, and then there's a few for Engineering New Zealand. This proposal seems quite focused on building and construction. A member asks, why then are all engineers affected by the new system?
Yeah, well, it did come from a building and construction focus. But when I went on this project, I looked at what other countries do, and the eastern states of Australia, they've either got or they're introducing occupational regimes for engineers. They cover pretty much the full spectrum of engineers. And then the other thing I did was I looked at Engineering New Zealand, the complaints against engineers. And yes, there is a fair share of complaints against those engineers in the building and construction sector. There are quite a few for mechanical engineers that you know, the NZTA have lodged. So that got me thinking about the risk. And yes, there is a risk in building and construction, but there are risks elsewhere in engineering. Engineering is inherently, it's complicated. Engineers are using maths and science to solve complex issues. And I don't think it's defendable from a public's point of view that you can say we're going to regulate engineers who design buildings, but we're not going to regulate those engineers who look after, say, a power plant, or design a bit of complex plants that might fail, potentially hurting someone or costing the client a lot of money to fix. So it comes back down to risk. And I think all facets of engineering have risk. Some manifest themselves more visibly than others. We do tend to hear about the building failures. What we don't tend to hear about is the failures that get resolved privately between engineers and their clients.
I think that's right. And one thing we hear a lot is that the future of engineering will be more multidisciplinary than it ever has been before. And so trying to separate out specific disciplines from all the rest is seems like a simple answer when you first hear of it, but it's, the more you think about it, the less sense it makes. And
just looking at the number of different disciplines that our submitters identify with, engineering, it seems to be a rapidly evolving profession, and there's lots of these specialty disciplines that, you know, to be honest, the government probably doesn't have a good handle on the level of risk for some of these evolving disciplines. We don't want to wait until there's a major accident.
Thanks, Caroline. I'll give you a little bit of a break now with
Thank
some
you.
questions for Engineering New Zealand, but I can see that there are some more for MB coming up. Richard, I'll pass this on to you. So Engineering New Zealand currently manages both professional body services as a membership organisation and registration services as the registration authority. Is this a conflict, and how could this be managed in the future?
So I think it may be a perceived conflict. I don't think it is an actual conflict because, of course, it's in the best interests of the profession that the engineers who work in the profession are operating at the highest possible standard, because it's when engineers fail to do that, it reflects badly on the profession. So I think there's a very good alignment between wanting to lift the standard of engineering and looking after both legislation and discipline. That said, we do recognise that the perception of conflict is an important one, and that's why Engineering New Zealand has actually separated out those two functions at a governance level. So our membership function is looked after by the Board of Engineering New Zealand, and sitting under that board to the side, completely independently, is the Chartered Professional Engineers Board, if you like, which looks after the registration authority functions. So I think going forward, you have clear separation at a governance level, which I think is really important. And that's one of the reasons we support the creation of the Registered Engineers Board, or, that's obviously the working title.
Two related questions here. For those of engineers who are currently CPinch, how will we support them during the transition? And if people are thinking about applying for CPinch, should they go ahead at this stage?
So first question, we'll continue to support anyone who's going through the CPinch process. And one of the key things we'll be doing is giving them information on what's going to happen, how the transition will work. If the licensing requirements are different to the current requirements under CPinch, we'll make sure people are very clear and understand exactly what the differences are and what they will need to do to become licensed. And then secondly, if you are considering applying to become a CPinch, my advice would be to just crack on. Because the CPinch is going to be valid for at least the next 6 years, till 2030, you will in fact get your whole term before you get reassessment as a CPinch. I also think if you are contemplating, becoming a licensed engineer in the future under this, one of the single best things you can do to prepare for that is to go through the CPinch assessment, because it's very likely that the licensing and CPinch will have many things in common. Licensing may be at a higher standard, but having got CPinch will be really a really good step towards that.
And there's a related question here, which complements what we've just been speaking about, that currently Chartered Professional Engineer assessments are relatively general rather than testing engineers on specific tasks or scopes of work. The question is, will licensing fix that? And the answer is maybe, if it's done right. Richard, my sense from the Cabinet papers is that licensing will be targeted at potentially more specific work than CPinches, and candidates may not be able to self-select their work samples for assessment the way they currently do. What's your sense about that difference between CPinch and licensing assessments?
I think one of the things we're very pleased about is the idea that licensing is, if you like, discipline specific, because I think that does allow it to be more focused. There aren't any details in the Cabinet paper about what exactly will be included in licensing, and nor do I think there necessarily should be. I think this is something that should be included in regulation so it can be regularly updated. And I think there is an expectation from both the public and the profession that licensing should be more rigorous than the current CPinch process.
Yeah, I do agree with that. One thing I'd just like to add is that when we do licensing classes, we do need the profession to get involved with that, because this is your area. The profession needs to tell us what needs to go into the licensing. What does a good engineer, what does a good competent engineer in this risky practice field, what do they look like, and what sort of eligibility requirements we need to put in there. But yeah, just reaffirming what Richard was saying, we do want licensing to be more specific, and I think it will be set at a higher standard than what CPinch is currently.
Well, you must be telepathic, Caroline, because you saw the next question coming.
I-
What would be the process for licensing, and what disciplines do you think would be first? So you've answered part of that already. What's your sense for what disciplines might be first for developing license classes? Because as we know, we can't do them all at once.
We can't do them all at once, but we do have some disciplines which we know are higher risk than others. We also have some other areas that do rely on CPinch, and we need to address that before we actually get rid of the CPinch credential. Recreational safety engineers, people who certify amusement devices is an example. It's quite a small group. They'll probably be fairly easy to get them into a license class, and then WorkSafe can look after them. But in terms of the other disciplines, we've indicated to ministers that we think the likely ones: recreational safety, I've talked about, structural engineering, fire, geotechnical. There's been a few others coming through submissions, such as water engineering, land transport, heavy vehicle certification that NCTA has done. But we're not looking at specifying in the primary legislation what these licensing classes will be, because we do want to provide that flexibility. It may be that in the future we decide that, you say geotechnical engineering, we decide it's actually, we were wrong, it's not high risk, it's low risk, so we can scrap that. Example, I don't think that would happen, but it's just giving us that flexibility to add or remove or amend licensing classes without having to go back through parliaments, because that is a long and tedious process.
And Engineering New Zealand is certainly really supportive of the approach that's being taken of keeping the primary legislation really focused on the high level nuts and bolts. Probably the engineers will say I'm using nuts and bolts wrong there, but and leaving the regulations to be as flexible as possible so that we can move with the profession during the future. Where am I up to? Gosh, these questions are coming in thick and fast. I can probably confidently say we're not going to get through them all today, so there will be some follow-up answers to come out after this webinar. But the next one is also for MB. How do you see the signing of producer statements working under the new system? So currently, for those of you who are not structural or civil engineers, currently CPinch engineers sign off on producer statements. How might that work?
I think this is going to be one of these, we need to wait and see questions and answers. We're going to need to just wait and see what's in the bill in terms of the transitional arrangements, and also what is going to be replacing. Is this going to be a structural engineering license that will replace it? So it's on our radar, but we can't answer that just yet.
And absolutely fair enough. A follow-on question from that one, is the intention that once the new system is in place, councils won't need their own lists of producer statement authorised signers?
Yeah, that's the hope. Engineers who are licensed will have demonstrated that they are competent, that they are skilled, and they are knowledgeable. And if they're neither of those things, then they won't be able to get a license. So yeah, the answer is councils should not need to have their own lists of the engineers that they trust.
Wonderful. I can almost hear the sighs of relief through the screen. Another question for you, MB. How will you be defining high risk? So if someone works on high risk work, should they need to be licensed?
Well, that's going to be defined in terms of the regulations. So this is another, we have to wait and see what comes out of the bill and actually the detail what's in the regulations. So the regulations will specify what sort of work is restricted to licensed engineers.
But you're not just talking about risk in terms of life, if I'm right, it's risk, environmental, economic.
Yeah, economic, yes. Yeah, it's broader than public safety. Yeah. But yeah, that detail will be in the regulations that will actually restrict the work. And that will vary also depending on the license class and what it is it's restricting.
Now, can you tell us what MB is thinking in terms of the costs of the new system? So if somebody has asked if they need to be both registered and licensed, could this be really expensive for them and their business?
Well, part of our suite of papers that is now on our website is a cost benefit analysis and a regulatory impact statement, which does set out the range of costs. We got a consultant in to do the cost benefit analysis for us. It's hard for us to tell with any certainty at the moment because we don't have the bill gone through. We haven't started setting up the regime, but we have taken a bit of a punt. So in terms of licensing, we have assumed that'll be a similar cost to CPinch. In terms of registration, we have estimated the average cost would be about $160 per engineer per year. But by and large, the biggest cost for engineers in terms of complying with this regime will be the cost of professional development. So this will be the loss of billable hours by having to do professional development instead of billing your clients, and also any costs of courses. So we have gone conservative because we don't know how many hours will be required just yet for professional development. We don't know how many engineers already are doing professional development, and you should all be as Engineering New Zealand members. And we also, we don't know whether this is in-house professional development or through webinars or courses, conferences that you go to. Worst case scenario, $3,000 per engineer per year. But that's assuming that you're not doing any professional development right now.
All right, this next question is for both Engineering New Zealand and MB. So perhaps we'll go to Richard first and then back to you, Caroline. Do you think that these proposals will address risks in the system? And second part of the question is, what else can be done?
So I think these proposals will address some of the risks in the system, and they will certainly lift the standard, because if licensing is at a higher level than chartered professional engineering, you'll by definition lift the standard in those areas. I think registration will allow a greater focus on continuing professional development and commitment to a code of ethics. One of the things for me, and I know it has to be included in the cost side on a cost benefit analysis, but I would say professional development is always an investment rather than a cost, because you should come out of it as a better engineer and therefore be able to deliver more for your clients and for your firms. I think the other things that need to be looked at is we need to constantly be looking at our education processes and making sure that the engineers that emerge from universities are meeting the needs of the profession and meeting the needs of the public. I think we need to look at how contracts are structured, particularly major infrastructure contracts and major construction contracts, to ensure that sufficient allocation of finances and of money to the design and particularly the peer review of projects. I would note that in New Zealand, our large-scale projects, typically the design phase is a very small percentage of the contract, which really crunches the design and the peer review. And I think by international standards, that does need to increase. So there is more peer review, there is more emphasis on design, because that's typically where things go wrong.
Thanks, Richard.
I don't really have much more to add to that. The issue of peer review did come through in submissions. I think there's, we can't blame engineers solely for engineering failures, because a lot of these engineering failures that we're concerned about are multifaceted. And I mean, one example that I had been thinking of was Pike River. Now, Pike River ultimately was a failure to address the mine's complex engineering needs, but I don't think we can blame the engineer in that case. It was, it was the managers, and it was, as Richard was saying, it was, the contracts and the financial parts. So I think this proposal will help reduce the risk, and it will help to reduce the risk of incompetent practitioners continuing to practice. Where there are mistakes, those mistakes can be sanctioned. We can, the particularly bad engineers, we will now have a mechanism to weed them out. But, can we say with absolute certainty that there won't be another engineering failure as a result of this? We can't, because there are many other forces in play here.
Thanks so much, Caroline. We've probably got time for one or two more questions, depending on how long the answers are. Another one for you, Richard. One member has commented that it feels like registration is dumbing down the system. Would you agree with that? Or will licensing raise the bar on how we're assessing engineers?
Registration would be dumbing down the system if registration was the only thing that was being done. I think the introduction of licensing means we should be lifting the standard, and I think registration will actually lift the profession, because suddenly there are consequences for being an incompetent engineer, whether or not you are a chartered professional engineer, whether or not you are a member of Engineering New Zealand. And so that puts an onus on people to do professional development, to abide by a code of ethics, and to puts them in a position where they can say to a manager or a client, actually, I'm not going to cut these corners because I want to remain a registered engineer. So I think it will lift overall.
And that's one of the things that we were pleased when we reflected on the proposal for mandatory registration. We thought of all of the times we get calls through our membership team or our complaints team with people raising concerns about an engineer, and we have to say, look, they're not a member of Engineering New Zealand, they're not a chartered professional engineer, so there's nothing we can do. And so mandatory registration is a good step in that regard. All right, we might stop there because it's 5 to 1 and people will no doubt have other commitments. I want to thank everyone who's dialed in today. There's a really large number of you online, so this topic is obviously, and for good reason, of importance to the profession. So thank you for taking time out of your busy days to be here with us today. Thank you to our presenters from MB and from Engineering New Zealand. Really appreciate your time as well. We have recorded this session today, so if you have colleagues or friends who are unable to watch it live, they'll have an opportunity later, and we're also holding another live session next week. So thank you very much. We'll now end the session, and we will be following up with answers to those other questions that we haven't had time to get to today.
Thank you, Stacey, and thank you very much, MB. We really appreciate your willingness to join us on the webinar, and also the hard work you've done to get everything through Cabinet. That was a really big win for the profession. So thank you very much.